This Choircast podcast is brought to you by How to Not Suck as a Christian. This book is a witty, no BS guide to unlearning the toxic parts of Christianity, like purity culture, apologetics, and the idea that God's love is limited to straight conservative Americans. It's sharp, it's irreverent, and it'll definitely make your fundamentalist aunt clutch her pearls. You can get the audiobook on Audible. Print and ebooks of How to Not Suck as a Christian are available to ship to your aunt wherever books are sold. Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? Damn. Being gay and trans is not a sin, full stop. The Bible doesn't say that. Oh yeah. You've made it to another book club episode of the Unbelief Podcast. We're taking a brief pause in our exploration of the book of Exodus and that story to go verse by verse, talking about the Bible verses that evangelical people use to say that being gay or being trans is a sin. It is not, and there has been so much activity online this week that I felt like we should take a little break, take a little breather, and dive headfirst into this. Now, I just want to explain, I want to fess up, and this is hard for me to do, that I have not always understood this. I've not always believed this. I grew up in the evangelical South, and it was before the internet, before you could just Google something and get other viewpoints. All I had access to was conservative people who gave me conservative answers and scholarship that wasn't accurate, and I thought that being gay was a sin. I had moments in my life where I said that. At one point, I left a church that was splitting over that issue because the conservative people weren't conservative enough for me. I made a big deal, and I am still ashamed of that to this day. And then there was this moment where this kid came up to me. I was working at a church with teenagers at the time and said, I need to talk. I could tell that he did not mean he wanted to talk in public right there. So we made an appointment to go meet at a coffee shop after school one day. We met there, and he looked at me and he came out to me. I was the first one he came out to, and I knew what I was supposed to say, right? I had been trained. I knew the verses. I knew that I was supposed to tell him he was going to hell, that he needed to stop being gay, that he needed to, all of those things. I had planned out that when that happened to me, what I would say. And when I looked at him, he had fear written all over his face. Like I looked at him and I knew that my beliefs would crush him. And so, I don't know, call it the Holy Spirit, call it God, call it basic human decency. I didn't say those things. I looked at him and I thanked him for telling me that. And I was there for him in that moment. And that is a key moment in my journey in this, where I knew there was something wrong with my theology, that my theology should not crush people. And I didn't have an answer for it. I'll be honest. I just lived in this in-between space where I knew what I believed and I didn't enforce it on other people. I didn't share it anymore. the way that I had shared it in the past. And I don't know, I just waited. I went to seminary. I got the tools that you get in seminary, and eventually, through deep study, I changed my mind. And so I want us to go through that. I want us to go through verse by verse. But before I do that, I want to say that we don't have to play on this field. Right, this is the evangelical field. This is the fundamentalist field. This is the biblical literalists field. They want to say that you have to take the Bible literally. You have to do all of these things. And we're going to go verse by verse and explain what it really says. But we don't have to play on that field at all. And I'll explain that at the end here. But I also know that if you ever want to talk to somebody in your family, in your life about this issue who is in that stream, you are going to need to know some of this, whether or not you choose to express that to them. So yeah, let's just start at the very beginning of the Bible. There is this verse in the book of Genesis, and in the book of Genesis, it says, like right there at the beginning, people will talk about when God created humanity, and there's a point that it says God created humanity in God's image, male and female, He created them, and they say that this says that. Male and female that's the only two genders. So that affects trans people. And that, the really homophobic comment that my pastor would make growing up was, God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And he would say it like that. He had a Southern accent. I'm bad at doing accents, so I apologize. But that does not address human sexuality at all. It does not address being trans. It says that the first two humans God created were male and female. And that's important because if you say that is talking about something other than that, it's a logic fallacy called arguing from silence, right? If it says nothing, you can't just make up what it says, right? And then there's another verse in the Bible. It says that is why a man leaves his. It's in Genesis 2:24, and it says that's why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. That's Genesis 2:24. Again, same thing. It's talking about heterosexual marriage. It is not talking about homosexuality. It's not talking about trans people. It's not talking about any of that. It's describing heterosexual marriage. It's describing marriage. And so if you want to talk about heterosexual marriage, that's a verse that you can use. And I think if you want to talk about marriage in general, right, that's a safe place as well, because it's talking about marriage, and it says that two people leave their families and they become united in one, and all of that, right? That's what marriage is about, uniting and becoming one. I think that's fair, but it doesn't talk about homosexuality or trans people. Okay, that's Genesis 1 and 2. Then we come to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. This is an interesting story, and I will, for those of you who didn't do the reading, I'll tell you the rough outline of the story. So the rough outline of the story is that these two men who are angels, who are messengers of God, whatever, they show up in the town of Sodom. And in the town of Sodom, they stay in the city center and nothing happens. Now, when we read that and nothing happens, we don't really think much of it. But it would be a scandalous statement in the ancient world into which this was originally written, because this is before hotels, right? This is before Hampton Inn. And so they sit there, and there's this expectation in this culture that when people travel from town to town and they show up in the city center, people from the town will come to them immediately and say, oh, where are you from? Where are you traveling? It's getting late. Come and stay at my house. And they would bring you into their home. They would feed you. And then the next day you'd get up, you'd be on your way to the next town, and the same sort of thing would happen. And that's how you traveled long distances from town to town in that day. That's the way that happened. That's not happening. It is scandalous. It shows that there's something wrong in this town, that they have sort of lost their center, that it's this foreshadowing that this is a bad place. So when it's getting really dark, this guy named Lot, if you remember, that's Abraham's nephew. Lot comes up and is like, hey guys, it's getting late. Come over to my house. They come to his house, and he feeds them. And then it says, every man in the town shows up. Okay. Every single one shows up at the outside of Lot's house, and they bang on the door, and they demand that Lot put these two men outside so that every man in the town can have sex with them. Okay. Lot refuses. It's really bad. And then Lot does something, Lot does something really horrible in that he offers his daughter. But the two angels stop that from happening. Thank God. It shows eventually, by the way, Lot is seen as a righteous person, but it shows there how messed up this town was, right? And how a righteous person can, in the wrong place, be led into thinking that some things were okay, right? That normalizing some behavior. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever felt that, right? You move to a place, maybe a place that is really racist or maybe even really homophobic, and you aren't, but then over the days and weeks and months and years, all of a sudden you start becoming comfortable with it. Yeah. Then you go visit somebody, you talk to somebody who's known you for a long time, and they're like, dude, what's going on? Why are you okay? Why didn't you stand up? Why didn't you speak up in that situation? And you realize, I've drifted. I've been around these people for so long that I've gotten desensitized to this. Yeah. Okay, so back to Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. What's happening there is not homosexuality, right? Homosexuality is not a gang of men demanding that two men be let out so that they can. That is gang rape. That is gang rape, and it is not okay. Period. The end. Okay. Now, later in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, it says, it's really interesting in that it actually says that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was that they, it says, Ezekiel 16:49, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She did not support the poor and the needy. Yeah. Okay, so let's move to the next passage. It's in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. Maybe take a breath. That was a lot. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is pretty intense. Leviticus 18:22. This might be the book that is most often quoted by people that are trying to be hateful to the LGBTQ community. There's two verses in the book of Leviticus, and the book of Leviticus is a little bit problematic in general because it's a set of instructions for the Levites, which are the people who work in the temple. So it's targeted towards a specific group. But I don't want to come across as saying like I think Leviticus is bad or evil. It's not. I actually particularly love this book. Like, I love this book because it is very bound to its culture. We're going to discover that. And I love culture. I love understanding stuff about ancient Near Eastern culture. And I love sort of teasing out the culture from the Bible to help you understand the main message and then apply that message to the world now, right? So I love the book, but these are two verses that have been used to be just really, really hateful. In Leviticus, I mean, there's lots of words that are used, lots of verses that are used to say insane things in our modern culture that don't mean the same thing. Like, it says that tattoos are a sin. It actually talks about, it says eating meat with blood in it is a sin, or cutting the edges of your hair also a sin. So, none of those things are a sin. Okay, so let's look at Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. The version I grew up hearing in church was the NIV, New International Version. It's problematic on a number of levels. One of the things that's problematic about it is that the scholars believed that the Bible has one voice. It's univocal. The Bible is not univocal, and there's multiple places where the translators tweak the translation, tweak the words so that it makes it seem like there's not as much disagreement in the Bible. It comes from a very conservative evangelical lens. So it's problematic. New International Version, but this is what it says. This is one I grew up hearing. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. The King James Version is the one often on the picket signs by the super conservative people. It says, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Abomination. Yeah, that's a tough word. Now, if you read just those two translations, right, it seems pretty straightforward. But part of the problem here is in the English translations, right? The word used in Hebrew is mishkabe, and it has a particular nuance. Instead of talking about like sex with your partner, it suggests something different. This word carries with it the idea of roaming, of something closer to sleeping around, or maybe even stronger, more like sex addiction. The other thing, some scholars have also asserted, this isn't the majority of scholars, but there's a significant number that have asserted that this could also be talking about sex acts that happened in the worship of other gods, which makes sense in the context of Leviticus that is giving instructions to priests for the worship of God, right? That makes sense. In fact, there's a lot like the tattoos, the cutting the hair. That's all about worshiping other gods. So this is another thing that could also mean that. But the other thing is that there's actually very few instances of this particular word in the ancient world. And that's important to note because if there's only a couple of references to this word, you can only find it in a couple of places, it can be difficult to really know what it means. You can get a sense of it, right? Context clues, all of that kind of stuff. You can get a sense, but without a number of references, any translation of it is a little bit less reliable than, other more common words. And so that's important. And so there are multiple ways, multiple words, and mapping those ancient words from ancient cultures onto our modern words and our modern culture. It's really complicated. And, we can give some people the benefit of the doubt, right? Like even people with the best intentions, like the absolute smartest people with the best intentions, sometimes just have to make decisions. They have to make calls on random details that push a meaning in one direction or another, right? Okay, so that's the first one. That's Leviticus 18:22. It's not talking about sex between loving people in a loving relationship, right? It's not talking about partnership. It's not talking about that, right? It's talking about something else. Now, I told you there's another verse in Leviticus. It's chapter 20, verse 13. We're not going to have to spend as much time on this. You're going to have it. I'm going to just sort of like parenthetically give you the word. If a man lies, mishkabe, with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. So again, mishkabe, same word. That's the same word we just talked about. So we're not talking about the modern concept of homosexuality, where people of the same gender might fall in love and want to spend their lives together. It's talking about something else, right? And in the Old Testament, man, I mean, sex and sexuality is treated very differently. We'll really deep dive into that, but like men are allowed to sleep around and women aren't. I mean, it's a big deal. All right, so that's Genesis and Leviticus. And that is every verse in the Old Testament that people will argue are directly address homosexuality. That's it. Every single one. Okay, now I hope that you're like, wait a second, that's not many verses, and you are right. And basically it boils down to translations that are not nuanced. Like, yeah. The other questions it asks, like, well, what about women and women? Where does it address two men getting married, or two women, or trans people? Like, where are those things? They aren't there. They aren't there. They aren't there because the ancient world viewed sex and sexuality completely different than we do. We'll talk about that at the end. I'm teasing that because I just want you to understand that's how we don't play on this field. But let's keep going. We're gonna go and go to the very next verse. We're gonna pause to note that the next verse is in Romans. That means we're skipping all what Jesus said, all the gospel stories. Now, there's a moment in the gospel where Jesus quotes that passage in Genesis that we just talked about. Again, not talking about queer people, but like that's it. And that verse is from Genesis, not from Jesus. So we're going to skip over all of what Jesus said. We're going to skip over Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We're going to skip over the book of Acts, which is like the early church history book, to the book of Romans. And the book of Romans in chapter 1, starting in verse 18, I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 27 yourself. But I'm just going to sort of zero in on the part of that passage because the whole passage is helpful. But I want you to, I'm not going to read that. It's just annoying to listen to somebody read that much, right? So let's go down to verse 26. It says, for this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions. Their females exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also the males, giving up natural intercourse with females, were consumed with their passionate desires for one another. Males committed shameless acts with males and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. All right. I want you to listen to this. It is very specific. Now, remember, they don't have the same understanding of gender and sexuality as we do. We have had a lot of psychology. We have had a lot of time. Like, the scientific method didn't exist back then, right? So they don't have the same understanding as we do. So what we have to do is listen for what it says and then try to translate that into our world. Okay? Well, let's look at it. It says their females exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also their males giving up natural, that's important, natural intercourse with females were consumed with their passionate desires for one another. Okay, now, listen to that. Natural, okay? Now, when we talk to people, like when you listen to people who are queer, they will tell you that they are naturally inclined to whatever gender they are inclined to. That is their natural desire. Some of them it's for multiple genders, like they're bi. Some of them it's trans people and males and females. They're pansexual. Some people it's being gay, like two men. Some people it's lesbian, being two women. Right there's all kinds. Okay, but they'll tell you in the words of the most holy Lady Gaga, blessed be she. I'll tell you they were born that way. That's their natural desires. And so if you listen to this verse, it says these people exchange their natural desires for unnatural ones. And it's talking about straight desires, one gender attracted to the opposite gender. But we know that these LGBTQ people, they are born this way. This is their natural state. And so really, if you translate that into our modern understanding, it means that it's wrong for gay people to try to be in straight relationships, right? In the same way that it is wrong for straight people to be involved in gay relationships or lesbian relationships or whatever, okay? Just be who you are. I mean, that's, in one sense, it's one of the things that we can get from this. Be who you are. Like, God created you as a beautiful person, and the task of life is also learning who you are and continuing to try to know who you are as you grow and expand into this life. But be who you are, right? Now let's go to the next verse. Let's go to the next verse. That is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. And really, we're going to look at a pair of verses, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10. And it's, again, there's two important words. The words are malakoi and arsenokoitai. So the first word, malakoi, again, this isn't one of these that's really rare, which makes it hard to translate. The version of Greek is called Koine Greek. And it just, malakoi doesn't occur very many times, but it occurs in both of those verses. And I'm going to read the verse, 1 Corinthians. I'm going to read it in the New Revised Standard Updated Edition version, because you're going to notice something. It says, do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. The sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, men who engage in illicit acts, that's that word malakoi, men who engage in illicit acts, thieves, greedy, drunkards, revelers, swindlers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God, okay? You'll notice that homosexuality doesn't appear in that version. I'm quoting from the translation that scholars say is the most reliable, the New Revised Standard Updated Edition, and you don't see homosexuality there. Now, the one I grew up with, remember, the NIV, here's what it says. Or do you not know the wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men. That's malakoi. Okay, you see that? So this idea of men engaging in illicit sex, instead of translating it that way, the First Corinthian or the New International Version chose a conservative understanding of what might be men engaging in illicit sex. They're saying, oh, men engaging in illicit sex must mean gay men, right? But that's not what it says. Okay. It says men who engage in illicit sex. That is different. It can mean a number of things. And when men have sex with men, that is not illicit. Okay. We have a different understanding. We understand who people are. We understand gender and sexuality because we have 2,000 years worth of science and all of that. It's not illicit. So that's that one. Okay, now let's move to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10. It says, the sexually immoral, men who engage in illicit sex, but there, it's not malakoi, it's arsenokoitai. Remember, I told you that one. Slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I was entrusted. That's 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10 and 11. Okay, again, that's arsenokoitai. It was, in the reliable translation, translated as men who engage in illicit sex. Now, in the New International Version, it's translated as homosexuality. It says, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality. That's the arsenokoitai word. Again, these conservative scholars pushed it towards what they thought was an illicit act for men. Okay? But that word arsenokoitai is even more problematic. Because one of the things that you can do when you have a word that is not really well understood, that we don't have a lot of instances of it, is you can go back and you can look at what the sort of history of the translation of that word, right? You go back, you look at older translations as far back as you can go. Like you look at the French translation, look at the German translations, like throughout history, look at what like Martin Luther translated it as, right? And you see that there's something really interesting for arsenokoitai. That word was not translated as men who have sex with men or homosexuality. That word was translated as pederasty, pedophilia, that kind of word in those languages. And this shouldn't have to be said. But knowing what this previous episode with Austin telling his story, homosexuality is not pedophilia. They are very different things. They are not related. And that lie that continues to be perpetrated by fundamentalists is damaging and not accurate. That's how that word was translated for years and years and years and years and years until the 1940s 40s when that word was used in a new translation. And we actually have record of it, that like a graduate assistant kind of person that was reviewing it sends a letter to the translator that was responsible for that section and says, hey, we've got this wrong. We need to change it. The translator writes back, says, yes, it is wrong. We do need to change it. It doesn't mean homosexuality. And it didn't get changed. Yeah. And it has continued to be translated that way and plague the church and queer people for a long time. Okay. So that is those two passages. So there is one more that sometimes is referenced. It says, is in Jude 6. Jude only has one chapter, so there's only verses, Jude 6 and 7. It says, the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah, the surrounding towns gave up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah is the reference here. We've already been there. We've already done that. The sexual immorality there was gang sexual violence. It is not queer people, right? It is not gay people, trans people. But let's talk just a minute now about trans people. And so there's a couple of this one verse, Deuteronomy 22:5. People point to, it says, a woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. So some people are convinced that forbidding the Jewish people from dressing in clothes associated with a gender different than their own was like a way it meant is referring to trans people. It is not. There is Canaanite and Syrian religion where this was a part of how they worshipped other gods, and there is this constant trying to set apart the Jewish people, get them to do a different kind of worship and relate to God in a different way than the surrounding areas. Like, this is how we are distinct from these other religions. This is one of those ways. In those religions, this was one of the ways they worship those gods. And this is saying, don't worship those other gods. That's what it's saying. Okay. Now, what I'm about to say is a little bit problematic in the trans community. And so I just want to preface this by saying there have always been trans people, okay? But cultures have not always had the understanding and the right words to describe trans people in the way that we would understand them. We would understand that experience, the way we would understand that today. Okay, so you're not going to find the word trans in the Bible, right? You're not going to find it. So when you are looking for things, you have to listen to the scholars and you have to say, okay, what is the closest thing, the closest word, the closest life experience as described in the histories, the thing that is closest to trans people. And there is a group that like freely moved between the world of males and females in a sort of native way and was not thought of specifically as being gendered in the way that the rest of the culture was gendered. And when you look at that, scholars say That is the closest experience that we know of that is described in the ancient Near Eastern world to the experience that trans people today describe. It is not a one-for-one. It is not the same thing. And I'm sort of saying all of this to let you know that, like, I know that. And we're going to talk about in just a second how we don't have to play on this field. But for evangelical people, when we are communicating with them, this can be a useful tool, okay? And the word is eunuch. Eunuch are people that had their reproductive organs removed in one way or another. And in Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, it says, "For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth." Okay, so there are some people who are born that way, who are born without reproductive organs or with both reproductive organs. We know this. This is just a biological fact that that there is a percentage of people that are in this range from having both or part of both sets of reproductive organs, none, right? All of that stuff. That happens. So it says there's some who have been so from birth, and there are some who have been made that by others, right? They have been captured, had their gender, their reproductive organs removed and treated as not gendered, right? And then there are eunuchs who, it says, have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So there are people that choose this for themselves, and that's important because that means that this is not just a passive thing. This can also be an active thing. They can choose this identity, this non-gendered identity for themselves. And here's what it says. Jesus uses kingdom of God language for them. He doesn't demonize them. He doesn't say that they're not good, that they're evil, that they are deranged, or any of the awful things that in some circles in the modern world are said about trans people. Okay? That is not the case. And I want to underscore that. I want to also underscore that I know that it's not exactly the same thing. Okay? Just to be clear. There are trans people that are exactly having a very exact same experience as trans people are today, right? Internally, like all of that stuff. But that's important. The other thing that's important to understand is in Judaism, in the 2nd century in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is called the Oral Torah. It is a collection of writings of rabbis that are seen as authoritative in a different way, not in the same way as the Torah, but in a way that people respect that and say, if we don't understand something, let's go to the Mishnah. Let's see what the rabbis said. Okay. In the 2nd century Mishnah, so this is right around that same time that the New Testament is, right? They didn't just have 2 genders. They recognized 6 genders. There's a gender called tumtum, which it's not a distinct gender, but a state of between male and female. Like, I'm not going to commit to one or the other. There is male, there is female, there is androgynous, there is Ilonid, which is a person who was assigned female at birth, but is barren and perhaps masculinized. And then there's Saris, which is a eunuch, either by birth or by choosing it, right? Those are the genders. 6 genders. So much more expansive and inclusive than our modern understanding, right? Than some of the conservative people want to argue. So, and that sort of leads us into this last piece of the puzzle. The last piece of the puzzle is to just say, okay, yes, like what I've been saying, we don't have to play on that field, but this is the stuff that is on that field that we can talk about. But we don't have to play on that field. And that is because culture There are many things that are defined, that are culturally defined, right? Marriage is culturally defined, right? What marriage means, how marriage happens. And it's culturally defined. You don't have to go to ancient cultures to see that, right? Right now, on planet Earth, there are marriages that are arranged marriages in some cultures. There are marriages that are, it is expected that the man is older than the woman in some cultures. There are marriages that people fall in love, and it is the agency of the couple that brings the marriage into existence. And then how you are married is also culturally defined, right? You go to weddings and marriage ceremonies for different people in different cultures, you will see it is so different. Marriage is culturally defined and changes from culture to culture. Gender, also culturally defined. Gender roles, culturally defined. How do men act? What do men wear? How do women act? Just like really a tiny, minuscule thing, but like right now, when I was growing up, boys, the color for boys was blue. The color for girls was pink. If you go far enough back, just several hundred years, that's swapped. Again, everything like that around gender, sex, sexuality is culturally defined. In the Bible, sex was not mutual, right? Sex was what something of the person in the higher social hierarchical position did to the person in the lower social hierarchical position, right? And violating the social hierarchy was wrong, evil, a sin, right? That's really important. Violating the social and so like for a man to have sex with a man or a woman to have sex with a woman, you don't have the hierarchical difference between the people engaged in that act. And that means that one person is the dominant that shouldn't be, and one person is the submissive that shouldn't be. Okay. And so that is a cultural thing, right? Women were property. They were sold by their family to their husband in the Bible. Like all of that is very, very, very different. What that means is that you don't take an ancient culture and try to replicate it today. It's a bad idea. They didn't understand things nearly as well as we do now. And so what you have to do, like you just can't map an ancient culture one for one onto a modern culture. Instead, what you have to do is take the cultural elements out of the ancient text and see what is left, see what the meaning is, and then apply that meaning in your modern cultural context. That means that if you are a culture that dates people, right? These ideas can be applied to dating. If you are a culture that does arranged marriages or courtship or whatever, these principles can be applied to that. If you are an LGBTQ person, these principles can be applied to your relationships, right? And it doesn't demonize any of those relationships at all. What it says is that in your culture, do these things, be these people. And the people, the thing that you see, man, let me just sort of give you a taste of one of the things I see that impacts this, a bigger message of the Bible. Right in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, everything comes undone. All the stuff is bad. Relationship between humanity and God, humanity and the earth, humanity and each other, all broken. And then you see that God makes a covenant with one person, with Abraham. And then with one family. And then with one people. And then with one nation. And then in Jesus, you see it breaking forth to all of the earth. what you see in that bigger narrative with that bigger message is greater and greater, more and more expansive acceptance, right? More and more inclusion of people into the life and work of God. Like once I see it, I can't unsee it. So that means for me that when I see something like that, like when I see something that seems to exclude people, I look at it and let it go. It just doesn't match what I know about God, when I see from this ancient spiritual text. Like when I see an ideology or a theology that treats anybody as just evil to the core, it's gone. I let it go. That's not grace. When I see somebody preaching things that are hateful or demeaning, things that like perpetuate injustice and systemic evil, it's gone. We're done. We don't have to hold on to that. When I see leaders that claim to be Christian and have power in the world, trying to use that power to limit the rights of people and make a culture less inclusive, nah. Mm-mm. They can claim to be following the Bible all they want. That is not what I understand. And so like, I guess what I'm saying here is you don't have to play on their field, right? The culture thing, the inclusive thing, these bigger messages. You don't have to play on that field. There is more than the Bible that helps us understand our beliefs, that helps us find the people that we want to be. But if you have people that play on that field and you're trying to have a conversation with them, I hope this helped. I hope it helps you talk about queer people, about trans people, but all the things, right? Yeah. This is a book club, and book club means that there's got to be the club. The club, the people that are discussing this, they're in a thing called Not Church. It is a completely open, completely inclusive. It doesn't matter who you are or any of that stuff. We are all there for each other. It's like church in that like we're talking about spiritual things. We're trying to support each other, but it's also not like what a lot of us have experienced in church, right? There's nobody there telling you you're going to hell because you don't believe the right thing. If you're interested in that, you go to patreon.com/skepticpastor, patreon.com/skepticpastor. It's $3 a month. It's $3 because we're not going to ask you for a percentage of your income. It's pay for what you get. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, that's okay. Just stop paying. And wherever you're listening to this podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you leave us a review. Give us all the stars, and if you actually write something, wow, it's a huge deal for us. And of course, sharing this with your friends. This one in particular, saying, hey, you should listen to this podcast. It goes verse by verse. It'll help. And I'm so glad you were here with us. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.